Alrighty, let's take a look at this example over here. So you can see they're talking about the company frequency distribution represents the square footage of a random sample of 500 houses that are owner occupied year round. They want us to approximate the mean and standard deviation of the square footage. So when we click on this table, you will see this is what our frequency distribution table looks like. So they're giving us the square footage and then the frequency of those 500 houses here. So what I would recommend to do is either opening it in Excel or StatCrunch, whichever program you're comfortable with. I'm actually going to go ahead and open this in Excel. So when I open it in Excel, it comes out looking something like this. I've of course added a couple extra columns in here, but those first 4 columns is what you will see gets downloaded when you open this in Excel. Now, when we're talking about calculating the mean for a frequency distribution table, this is from your textbook page. This is what the formula looks like. So in this case, that X sub I that you see is what will be the midpoint for each class that we have. And then of course the F sub I represents the frequency of that class. And of course, N is going to be the total number of classes that we have. So the first thing we will need to do is find the midpoint for each one of our classes. And then we will need to multiply it by our frequency to calculate that numerator. And you will see right over here, they're talking about a class midpoint. So you take the class midpoint by calculating the sum of consecutive lower class limits and then dividing it by 2. So let's take a look at that here. So as you can see, our lower and upper class limit is going to be 0 and 499. Then we move on to the next class, which is going from 500 to 999 and so on and so forth. These are the original categories, as you can see. So when you are calculating the midpoint, we are basically going to go ahead and add 2 consecutive lower class limits. So you're actually adding the 0 with the 500, and then you divide that by 2, and that's going to give you the midpoint. So that will be the same thing we do for the next class. So this is where we will take our 500 and we are going to add it with the 1000 and then divide that by 2. So this is how we go about calculating all of them. So we'll go and just pull this all the way down to the last class over here, but you will actually need to modify this very last calculation over here. If you were doing this by hand or by a handheld calculator, it would still be the same thing. So for our last class, you will see this is only going from 4,500 to 4,999. And we don't really have anything in this box over here. So that's why this number is coming out to be incorrect. So if you think about this, if this upper limit is ending at 4,999, and let's say if we had another class starting after that, it would be starting at 5,000. And you will see as soon as I put that 5,000 in here, my calculation is corrected over here because now I'm using 4,500 plus 5,000 divided by 2. So you will need to fix this last value over here, okay? Now, moving on to the next step, we have found the midpoint for each one of our classes here. Now, the next thing we need to do is multiply our frequency value with our midpoint. So that's what we're going to be doing here. And this is the next part of our formula. So on the numerator, you are multiplying the midpoint with the frequency. So again, I'm just going to let Excel do the calculation for me. So I'm taking my frequency and multiplying it with my midpoint for each of my classes. So just go ahead and multiply that. And again, I will just use Excel to go ahead and do that calculation for me. So we can go ahead and get all of those multiplications taken care of. And again, you can just verify and see that for each class, we are multiplying the frequency with the midpoint. Now, the next thing we will need to do is add all of our totals over here. So for the numerator, we need to get a total for that column where we multiplied the frequency with the midpoint. And on the denominator, we need a total of the frequency column. So let's go ahead and get the total for our frequency column. So we can use the sum function, SUM. And I'm just going to select all of these values from my frequency column. Go ahead and add those together. And we know this should come out to be 500 because in this example, they're telling us this was a random sample of 500 houses. So that verifies really well with what we expected. So 500. Do the same thing here for the frequency multiplied with the midpoint column. So we'll again go ahead and add this column. So I'll do my sum and then select this column, close parentheses, enter. So now you will see I have the total for my frequency times the midpoint, and I have my total for the frequency column. So now to calculate our mean, all you have to do is take this total for the frequency multiplied by the midpoint column and then divide it by the total number of frequencies, which is going to be 500. And that gives you your mean value, which comes out to be 2,415 square feet. So let's go ahead and plug that in here, 2,415 square feet. And there you go, that works out. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at how to calculate our standard deviation for this. So to calculate the standard deviation for a frequency distribution or group data, you have this formula again from your textbook over here. Now, I actually find this formula a little too tedious because as you can see, you have to take the midpoint, subtract the mean from it, then square that result. After you square it, you multiply it with the frequency and then get a total for that whole column. And then, of course, on the denominator, you're just taking the total of your frequency column minus 1. Now here we have a shortcut method mentioned right over here. So this one you will see we are taking our midpoint, we square that, multiply it with our frequency, and then we subtract that from our midpoint multiplied by the frequency, add that together and then take a square, divided by the total number of our frequency column, and then divide that whole thing by the total number of frequency column, and then you end up taking a square root. So this one actually works a little bit better. You are obviously welcome to use this sample standard deviation formula from here also. And I wanted to show you one more version of this formula. Now it's based off of this shortcut method down over here. And this is from your handout that I have posted in D2L. So from this handout, I'm actually going to be using this version of the formula because I find that this one works a little bit easier. So just to show you how this works, let's get back to our Excel spreadsheet over here. So the first thing we are going to do is we are actually going to square our midpoint. So you can see we already calculated the midpoint in this column. So what we're going to do over here is square that. So basically just say equal to, and we take this cell and multiply it into itself. So that will go ahead and square our midpoint value. And again, I'm just going to autofill that for the rest of the classes. So we have a square on our midpoint. The next thing we do is multiply our frequency with the midpoint squared. So again, multiply your frequency with the square of the midpoint. So this column that we just calculated. So we go ahead and multiply that again. Go ahead and autofill your columns for the rest of them. And then we need to add the total, get the total over here. So again, I'm going to use our sum function and go ahead and add up this column here. Okay, so this here represents the total of our frequency times the midpoint squared, which is actually going to be this part of the formula. So frequency times the square of the midpoint, and then you take its total. So we already got that. We actually already calculated this part when we were finding the midpoint, because this is where you're multiplying your frequency with the midpoint and you get its total. And then you're actually taking a square on top of that. So that's actually this total right over here. So we already have the total. All we have to do is square this value. So basically what you end up doing is we are taking n, you will see that here, multiplied by the total of our frequency times the midpoint squared column. So basically, and again, I'm just going to do this over here. So this will be equal to, I'm going to take the total of my frequency column, multiply it with the total of my frequency times midpoint squared. That will give me this value over here. Then from this number that we just calculated, we will need to subtract the square of our frequency times midpoint column. So this one over here, but I'm actually going to put this in parentheses since I need to square this. So multiply this into itself. Okay, so that will give me this total over here. And you know, this is just giving it to you in scientific notation because this is a pretty large number, but that's okay. Just let it be in that format for now. So this actually has helped us calculate the numerator. So we did n times frequency times the x square columns total minus frequency times just the midpoint and then squared the whole thing. Now we need to divide this number by our total of the frequency column times n minus 1. So what we will do then is I'm actually going to do this in the space underneath that. I'm going to take this number here and divide it, and I'm going to put this in parentheses again. I'm going to divide it by 500 times, and I'm going to put that in parentheses again. Or you know what? Let's break it down this way. How about we do it separately? Let's calculate the denominator here. So we take 500 times in parentheses 500 minus 1. So this is our n times n minus 1 for the denominator. So here we have our numerator. Here we have our denominator. So the very last thing to calculate our standard deviation, we need to take the square root and then do the numerator divided by the denominator. So just next to our standard deviation box here, I'm going to do the square root function. And then inside the square root, we'll have numerator divided by denominator, close parentheses, and hit enter. So this is going to be our standard deviation. So we have 915.3966. And let's take a look at our rounding rules here. So they wanted to round it to 1 decimal place. So 1 decimal place, this number will become 915.4. And this is what we end up coming up with. Now, I just wanted to show you in case you want to use, let's say this formula over here from your textbook, the alternate version. So let's take a look at this one over here. We've actually done most of the work here. We already have this midpoint squared times frequency total. We already have the total of our midpoint times frequency column. So let's go ahead and see how we can use this formula over here. So how about, I guess I'll just show it to you over here. So this is where we are going to take, let's see, the total from our square times frequency, so that's going to be this number, minus, we are going to take this number here, multiplied into itself. So I'm actually going to put this in parentheses so we know that we're squaring these values. And then we have to divide this by the total of our frequency column So again, just inside the parentheses, I'm going to divide this by the total of our frequency column. So this will end up giving us the numerator. So that takes care of this entire numerator over here. And then we're just dividing it by the total of our frequency column, and then we have to do the square root. So for this guy, if we find the standard deviation, this will be equal to square root. And then we are taking this divided by just the total of our frequency column, close parentheses. And you will see, just because we're using a slightly different version of the formula, your number changes a little bit, but obviously you are still going to be okay in terms of your answer, because this one here will have a tolerance built in. So even if you typed in that 914.5, it would accept your answer over here. So I hope this kind of helps you out. And I would definitely suggest using Excel to help you do the calculations, because as you can see, these numbers come out to be pretty large. And instead of having to do them by hand, putting it into Excel or even Google Sheets, if that's what you're comfortable with, you should be able to follow these calculations along. So I hope that this helps you out. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, thank you very much. Take care.